Hello, welcome back to another story with Rob. This week we have Mr Fussy, another Mr Men book by Roger Hargreaves. Mr Fussy, a green one this time. Let's see what his adventure is. Mr Fussy was fussy about everything. Absolutely everything had to be neat and tidy and in its proper place. Mr Fussy spent all day and every day rearranging his furniture and making sure the flowers grew in a straight line in his garden and trying to find specks of dust where there couldn't possibly be specks of dust because he spent all his time making sure there weren't any specks of dust. Very fussy indeed. One fine morning, Mr Fussy was having breakfast. He was very fussy about what he ate. He opened the marmalade pot. "Ugh," he exclaimed, "it's got bits in it." And he spent the rest of the morning separating the bits from the marmalade. Or, if you prefer, the marmalade from the bits. Fussy old fuss pot, people used to call him. Then Mr Fussy went out in his garden and spent the rest of the day straightening out all the blades of grass on his lawn. Fussy old fuss pot. That evening, Mr Fussy was in his kitchen, ironing his shoelaces, when he heard a crash outside. "What's to do?" he murmured to himself, and hurried outside to investigate. There, with a broken garden gate in one hand and an old battered suitcase in the other, a sheepish grin on his face, stood an untidy person. Mr Clumsy. "Whoops," he said, holding up the garden gate. "Came off in my hand." "Who," spluttered Mr Fussy, looking in horror at his garden gate, "are you?" They look quite similar. "I'm Mr Clumsy," replied the untidy person, grinning, and he stepped forward to shake Mr Fussy's hand, but tripped over and fell on the lawn. Poor Mr Clumsy. "My grass," cried Mr Fussy, "my straight grass, you've bent it." And he got down on his hands and knees and started straightening the grass. "But who are you?" he asked over his shoulder, "and why are you here?" "I'm your cousin," replied Mr Clumsy, "your long-lost cousin from Australia. I've come to visit." "Aren't you pleased to see me?" continued Mr Clumsy cheerfully, knocking over a flower or two as he got up and picked up his suitcase, knocking over another flower or two or three. Mr Fussy quite obviously wasn't pleased to see him. "You better come in," he muttered. "I say," remarked Mr Clumsy, looking through the front door of Mr Fussy's house, "I say, what a neat little place you have here." And he stepped inside and tripped over his shoelaces, as he often does, and knocked over a chair and dropped his suitcase and fell into an untidy heap on the floor. "Whoops," he said. Mr Fussy shut his eyes and heaved a sigh and groaned silently to himself. Later that evening, after Mr Fussy had cooked them a meal, and after Mr Clumsy had helped with the washing up, 2 broken plates, they sat down to talk. Mr Fussy sat as he always did in a neat and tidy fashion. Mr Clumsy sat, as he always did, in a not so neat and tidy fashion. "How long are you staying?" asked Mr Fussy. "Oh, I don't know," grinned Mr Clumsy. "A few days, a week, a year, I haven't decided." When he awoke in the morning, Mr Fussy jumped out of bed and went into his bathroom. "Oh no," he gasped. "Oh no." Oh yes, Mr Clumsy had been in there before him. The towels lay in a heap on the floor, the bath was full of water, there were pools of water all over the bathroom floor, and half a tub of toothpaste. What a mess. Mr Fussy made it all neat and tidy as quickly as he could. Then Mr Fussy hurried downstairs. "Morning," he said to his cousin. "I've cooked you breakfast. Sit down." There was an awful mess everywhere. "There we are," said Mr Clumsy, carrying a plate of fried eggs, broken fried eggs, towards the table. "Breakfast!" And then he tripped over the shoelaces of his, and then the eggs flew through the air, and then they landed all over Mr Fussy. Sticky, greasy, yellow fried eggs. "Whoops," said Mr Clumsy. After a week, Mr Fussy's house didn't look like Mr Fussy's house anymore at all. Oh dear. Broken windows, the door. But after 2 weeks, Mr Clumsy decided to move on. "Thank you for having me," said Mr Fussy. "It was very nice to see you," replied Mr Fussy politely. But what he was thinking was, "It's very nice to see you going." "Cheerio," said Mr Clumsy, and off he went with his battered old suitcase. "Goodbye," called Mr Fussy, really meaning good riddance. Then Mr Fussy fussed around his house as he'd never fussed before. Fussy old fusspot. Polishing and mending and repairing and straightening and sorting out and cleaning and putting everything back exactly as it had been before Mr Clumsy had come to stay. He even dusted the flowers in the garden. That evening, Mr Fussy was in his kitchen, polishing an egg, when he heard a crash outside. "Oh no," he groaned, "not Mr Clumsy back again. It can't be. It mustn't be. It isn't." And it wasn't. It was somebody else. Somebody who had just walked straight through Mr Fussy's garden gate. Someone who can't help having little accidents. Somebody you may have met before. "Hello," smiled Mr Bump. "I've come to visit." There we are. Mr Fussy by Roger Hargreaves. So Mr Fussy likes fussing over people, so maybe he quite enjoys the visits. There we are. So we'll see again. I'm sure we'll have another Mr Men soon at some point. So thank you very much for watching. Nice to see you again, and hopefully I will see you next time for more stories with Rob. Bye-bye. Hello, welcome back to another Story with Rob. This week we have Mr Nonsense by Roger Hargreaves, a book full of nonsense. Let's see what he's getting up to. Mr Nonsense had no sense at all, not a scrap. I mean, he lived in a tree. A tree. Can you imagine? There he is in his tree. House on top of his pink tree. "Why do you live in a tree?" Mr Happy asked him one day. "Because," replied Mr Nonsense, "I tried living on the ground, but that was too high up, so I moved to a tree to be nearer the ground." "What nonsense," snorted Mr Happy. "Thank you," replied Mr Nonsense. And you know what Mr Nonsense likes to eat? Porridge. Nothing wrong with that, you might say. But porridge on toast? Really? "Why do you like porridge on toast?" Mr Nosy asked him one day. "Because," replied Mr Nonsense, "I tried porridge sandwiches and I didn't like them." Porridge sandwiches. And do you know where Mr Nonsense sleeps every night? In a rowing boat. In his bedroom. In his house. Up a tree. It's quite comfy, really. "Why do you sleep in a rowing boat?" Mr Strong asked him one day. "Because," replied Mr Nonsense, "I tried sleeping in a motorboat, but it was somewhat uncomfortable." Mr Nonsense lives, as you might very well expect, in a country called Nonsense Land. Now I know somebody else who lives in Nonsense Land. Do you? And there's Mr Strong. That's right, Mr Silly. I sense some silly nonsense happening. Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense were close friends and saw a lot of each other. They do tend to go hand in hand, nonsense and being silly. Mr. Nonsense was often round at Mr. Silly's house playing jigsaw puzzles. They used to throw the pieces at each other. How silly. And Mr. Silly was often round at Mr. Nonsense's house playing cards. They used to tear them up to see who could get the most pieces out of one card. What nonsense. However, this story is about the time it snowed in Nonsense Land. It didn't often snow, but one winter it did. Now tell me, what colour is snow? No. In Nonsense Land, when it snows, it doesn't snow white snow. It snows yellow snow. Don't ask me why, but it does. Yellow snow. And when Mr. Silly woke up one morning, the whole of Nonsense Land was covered. I say, he said when he looked out of his bedroom window, snow! And he was so excited he rushed round to Mr. Nonsense's house. Doesn't look much like snow to me. Mr. Nonsense was asleep in a boat. Wake up, cried Mr. Silly. Wake up and come and look out of the window. Whatever on earth is it? Grumbled Mr. Nonsense, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes as he got up and went across to his bedroom window. I say, he said, looking out. Custard! That isn't custard, you silly banana, cried Mr. Silly. That's snow. He rushed downstairs. Come on, he called. And that day, Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense had one of the very best days of their lives. They had a snowball fight. Mr. Silly's snowballs were round. Mr. Nonsense made snowballs that somehow or other came out square. They built a snowman, a very silly, nonsensical sort of snowman. A very big snowman. Come on, said Mr. Nonsense that afternoon. Let's go tobogganing. But we don't have a toboggan, said Mr. Silly. Oh no, we don't, agreed Mr. Nonsense. Mr. Silly thought. Oh yes, we do. And Mr. Silly ran back to Mr. Nonsense's house and came back with his bed. Whee! They shouted together as they slid faster and faster down the hill in their rowing boat toboggan. It was a wonderful day, and that evening, after having supper together, porridge pie, Mr. Nonsense suggested that they played a game. What shall we play? Asked Mr. Silly. Draughts, suggested Mr. Nonsense. I've forgotten how to play draughts, said Mr. Silly. Oh, it's easy, replied Mr. Nonsense. And went round and opened all the doors and windows. There we are, he said. Draughts. What nonsense. There we are. The end. Mr. Nonsense by Roger Hargreaves. A book full of nonsense. There we are. So, thank you very much for watching. Hope to see you next time for more Stories with Rob. Bye-bye. Hello, welcome back to another Story with Rob. This week we have Mr. Sneeze by Roger Hargreaves. Mainly because there are lots of sneezes happening in our house this week. Everyone seems to have caught a cold. And it's getting a little bit chilly as well. So, Mr. Sneeze in Cold Land, perfect book for this week. So, let's get started. This is Cold Land, which is a country somewhere near the North Pole. The weather in Cold Land is winter all the time. When it isn't snowing, it's freezing. And when it isn't freezing, it's snowing. So you can imagine how cold it is. There we are. All white from the snow. Because it's so cold in Coldland, everybody who lives there is cold as well. You can tell if someone comes from Coldland because everyone there has a red nose. And people in Coldland aren't the only ones with red noses. In Coldland, you can see red-nosed dogs chasing red-nosed cats, chasing red-nosed mice. In Coldland, you can even see red-nosed elephants. There's one. Big red nose. And what you hear most of the time in Coldland is a noise that sounds like this. I tissue. The sound of the sneeze is a very common noise indeed in Coldland. Which is not very surprising, is it? This is the story of Mr Sneeze, who lived in a small snow-covered cottage in Shivertown, the capital of Coldland. Every morning Mr Sneeze woke up, sneezed, got up, sneezed, got dressed, sneezed, went downstairs, sneezed, ate his breakfast, sneezed, and went to work, still sneezing. Poor Mr Sneeze. I don't like this sneezing all the time, he thought to himself every day, until one day he decided to leave Coldland and try and find a cure for sneezes. So that very same day, Mr Sneeze packed the things he'd need for his journey, mainly handkerchiefs, sneezed, locked his door, sneezed, and set off. He walked and sneezed and walked his way across Coldland, and then he sneezed and walked and sneezed for days and days until Coldland was far behind. See all his footsteps. As he walked away from Coldland, he noticed that there was even less and less snow, and eventually he walked so far that there was no snow at all. As he walked, he noticed something else. He wasn't walking and sneezing, he was walking and walking. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sneezing. Not at all, not a bit, not even the tiniest tissue. His big happy grin on his face. I wonder why I'm not sneezing, he thought to himself. But he must have thought his thought out loud to himself because a voice behind him replied, You're not sneezing because you haven't got a cold. Mr Sneeze jumped, turned, and there behind him stood a wise old wizard. His wise old beard. What's a cold? Asked Mr Sneeze. A cold is what you catch when you're too cold, said the wizard wisely. Oh, said Mr Sneeze, but I come from a country called Coldland where everyone is too cold all the time. Nonsense, snorted the wizard. It can't be too cold all the time because of the sun. And he pointed to the sun, which was smiling in the sky. But we don't have any snow in Coldland. Sun in Coldland, Mr Sneeze. No sun? Exclaimed the wizard. How extremely, extraordinary. We'd better do something about that then, hadn't we? Yes, agreed Mr Sneeze, not quite knowing what the wizard was talking about. How far away is this place called Coldland? Asked the wizard. Oh, it's miles and miles away, replied Mr Sneeze. In which direction? Asked the wizard. Mr Sneeze pointed. Shouldn't take long, said the wizard, who then waved his wand and muttered some magic words, which wouldn't be magic if we told you what they were. There he is. Whatever those magic words were, they worked. Before you could say sneeze, both Wizard and Mr Sneeze were transported to Shivertown, which you will remember is the capital of Coldland. As usual, it was snowing. I say, this is a cold, gloomy place, said the wizard. Achoo! Replied Mr Sneeze, who had started to sneeze again. Everything all covered in snow. Coldland certainly needs some sunshine, said the wizard, and that's going to take some rather special magic. Please hurry up, said Mr. Sneeze, who was rapidly turning into a snowman. Now, said the wizard, ignoring him, I'm going to say some magic words, and I want you to sneeze 3 times immediately afterwards. Poor Mr. Sneeze, with all the snow on him. The wise old wizard then held up his magic wand and muttered some magic words, which again wouldn't be magic if we told you what they were. Achoo! 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 Sneezed Mr. Sneeze. Then quite suddenly, as if by magic, which indeed it was, the sun came out from behind the big black clouds, and it stopped snowing. And there is the sun coming out from the clouds. There now, said the wizard, that should stop the sneezing. And then, after muttering some more magic words, and without waiting to even say goodbye, he disappeared. Mr. Sneeze just stood there in the sunshine, watching the snow begin to melt. His big, happy smile on his face. After that, the sun shone every day, and today, Coldland isn't like anything it used to be. You can't see red-nosed dogs chasing red-nosed cats chasing red-nosed mice anymore, and these days, the sound of the sneeze is a very uncommon sound indeed. And even Mr. Sneeze doesn't sneeze anymore. You can see all the colours of the houses now. And that isn't the only different thing about Mr. Sneeze, as he discovered himself when he looked in the mirror one morning. Can you see what was different about Mr. Sneeze? Something on his face. It happened one other time too. See if you can find the page where that was. Well, I think Mr. Sneeze, his nose is blue now because he doesn't have a cold. And this did happen further back through the book. There we are, just after Mr. Sneeze had spoken to the wizard. So there we are, Mr. Sneeze from Cold Town, which then wasn't cold all the time anymore, so he didn't have to sneeze as much. Mr. Sneeze, Roger Hargreaves. Number 5 on the Mr. Men. A good book, and hopefully everyone in our house will not have a red nose soon, and they will get over their colds and less sneezes around the house. So thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you next week for more Stories with Rob. Bye bye.